Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Chuck Collins, and I work at the Institute for Policy Studies. We actually have a New England office in Jamaica Plain above the Sam Adams Brewery. So if you're there on that tour, and you see that beer garden, just know that you can come visit us at our office, and the Wi-Fi works in the beer garden. So sorry we're not there, but we're really thrilled that you're here for this conversation with Marjorie Kelly. And I want to thank first some of the co-sponsored groups, the the New Economy Coalition. Anybody here from New Economy Coalition? And Boston Ujima. We have a couple representatives here from Boston Ujima. And actually, we're going to invite Lucas Turner Owens to come up as part of our discussion about things that are happening in this space. But we're going to let him relax and sit back for a moment, a little while. The Democracy Collaborative is our main host, but also thanks to Boston Impact Hub. And we're also thrilled that Brookline Booksmith is here selling books. Great local independent bookstore. So thank you for being here. And it's not too early to begin to think about who might like a copy of this book. Didn't have the good fortune to be here with us tonight. But whose birthday is coming up? Who's a worker ownership mensch who, you just really would love this book, So anyway, so that's a little bit of context. And I'm particularly thrilled to be part of this conversation. I think I was at Marjorie's, the release of Owning the Future a couple years back when her book Owning the Future came out. But I even remember going back a few more years when she wrote a book called The Divine Right of Capital. Anybody familiar with that book? Which really was one of, she was at that time co-founder, publisher of Business Ethics magazine, and was really putting out a kind of understanding that what in the current book she talks about capital bias, that idea that while there are many, many stakeholders to healthy economies, we sort of treat capital as the divine king. And that really opened up, it really cracked open a kind of a conversation starting 20 years ago, really, about what is the proper role of capital in a healthy economy. So we're thrilled that on the second day that the book is actually out, Marjorie and Ted were in New York City 2 days ago, so that was the, I guess it makes sense to start your book event in New York. You're launching a book because that's the capital of capital and the media center. But here we are in Boston, and we're kind of, some of us are the hometown crowd because Marjorie lives over Salem way. So we're thrilled that you could be here to celebrate the publication of this book, to be part of the sort of first conversations that we're having about it here in Boston. So I'm going to kind of have a conversation with Marjorie, and I'm going to encourage her to talk quite a bit about just some of the ideas in the book, where then I'll invite Lucas to come and talk a bit about Boston Ujima, reflect on that, and then we'll open up to your questions, and sometime around 8:30 maybe we'll get back to mingling, buying books, and having informal conversations. So how does that sound? Okay. So I am curious, and I mentioned Marjorie, but she's also, in her role today, is as a senior fellow, vice president of the Democracy Collaborative, which I would encourage you to say more about as our evening goes on. But, I mentioned this, The Divine Right of Capital. Why the book tonight is The Making of a Democratic Economy, Building Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few, which incidentally, for the many, not the few, is, you may recognize that. That is the British Labour Party's sort of manifesto, for the many, not the few. But tell us, why this book at this particular moment? And particularly coming on a book about the divine right of capital, and then a book looking at broader ownership. What's changed, and why today? Why this book?
Well, the first book, Divine Right of Capital, was really about the corporation and how it's designed around capital in the same way that the monarchy was designed around divine right. And so then I broadened the inquiry with Owning Our Future to look at how would you design things differently? How could you do ownership differently? And here we take on the whole economy. It's the question of that the whole economy is really designed for the 1%. I mean, there's a survey not too long ago. 70% of Americans said they think the economy is rigged against them. And they're right. It is. It's rigged against most of us. And so in the book, we unpack, well, how is it rigged and how could you actually unrig it? And that's work that is going on. There's thousands of people doing this work all over the country, and they have been doing it for a couple of decades. And since I published Divine Right, and that was 2001, so it's almost 20 years now, I've been amazed at how sophisticated and pervasive this work has become. Impact investing has grown up. That didn't really, there's been socially responsible investing, but this particular form of investing, particularly for social impact as well as financial returns, that has become tremendously sophisticated. And there's a whole movement for worker co-ops now, which we didn't used to have to the same extent. So there's a lot that has happened, I think, in terms of this space becoming more sophisticated, and yet conditions have gotten worse and worse and worse. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this book is to say we need to get serious and not just be a little project over here, or we're doing this little thing over here, but no, we are the next economy, and let's get serious about that.
In Owning the Future, you set up a framing of talking about an extractive economy, extractive capitalism. So we're living in a particular flavor of capitalism that seems to be, hoovering up the wealth of the commons, the wealth of the community, labor, etc., juxtaposed with the idea of a generative or regenerative economy. And you mentioned that in this book, but you also sort of really, in terms of language, come in on this idea of a democratic economy. And we have a bunch of, I'm curious just your reflections on sort of language and how does that connect to a wider conversation? Because we have the new economy, we have solidarity economy, there's a more revived discussion about socialism versus, so I think I'd be curious just what's your mental map as you take that out into the world?
Well, as a journalist, I've been tracking this whole space for about 30 years. And I would say 80% of the work is about language. How do you language this in a way that it makes sense to people, that it's intuitive, that it seems like your own? And I think what many people are trying to do is to language. What is the next economy? How do you name that? Now, so in the book we contrast the extractive economy with the democratic economy. And I'm deliberately avoiding the words capitalism and socialism. I think that those are very limiting. Those are 19th century constructs. And we are trapped for some reason in this idea that we have a binary choice, right? It's either corporate capitalism or it's state socialism, and those are the choices. And so I think when young people, when many young people say they're socialists, what they're saying is, I definitely don't want capitalism, right? And I think that that's right. Now, I do think that socialism is a word that might fly in Europe more than here. I know Jeremy Corbyn is using it in the UK, and he could well be the next prime minister.
Inshallah. Yeah.
Maybe so. And he uses that word. He also uses the word democratic economy, which is he uses both of those. I personally think that when you use the word socialism, you basically have hung a sign on your back and said, "Kick me," in this country. Really, it's just not gonna fly in the U.S. I don't think. I think some of the concepts are great. I mean, we talk in the book about publicly owned banks. I mean, a lot of socialism is about public ownership, and one of the models I love to point out is Bank of North Dakota. It's been around 100 years. It's owned by the people of that state. Do people know Bank of North Dakota? A few people do. Its purpose is to serve the people of the state. I mean, what a remarkable thing, right? The purpose is not to extract money from them. And so because this bank exists, there are 5 times as many locally owned banks in North Dakota per capita as in any other state. And these banks actually lend to local businesses, which the big banks have basically gotten out of the business. I was having a talk with Kat Taylor recently, who's the CEO of Beneficial State Bank, and she showed me some statistics. She said the 5 or 6 big banks are basically all hedge funds now. They're doing very little actual lending, maybe 10% of what they're doing is actual lending into the real economy. They're doing derivatives and trading and all kinds of crazy stuff. But locally owned banks, now they are supported by the Bank of North Dakota, and because there are more of these, that state weathered the 2008 downturn better than just about any state. And it's created a movement. We actually have somebody here tonight from, so it's the Public Banking, Hub Public Banking, is that the name of it?
We've gotten out of Hub, we're now working at the state level. We call ourselves the Mass Public Banking Group. We're sort of at Belking.
Mass Public Banking Group.
Yeah, and our website is masspublicbanking.org.
Good thing to know about. There's a movement around the country now for state and city-owned banks. The new governor of California was elected partly on a platform calling for a state-owned bank. So my point, so just to finish up the socialism point, so public ownership is sometimes appropriate, I think that's right, but there also are other forms of private business that can also be socially responsible, like B Corps and employee ownership, which I think is not part of the socialism frame.
I just saw something came over my email that it's the 100th birthday of the North Dakota Bank
nice.
Tomorrow.
That's great.
So we can say happy birthday, North Dakota Public Bank, and maybe someday we'll have one in here in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I love that story, and one of the things I recommend in this book is that each chapter really is grounded in narrative and a story of something happening in and around the country. And I don't know if there were stories or, you relate some experiences being on the Lakota, reservation and others, but maybe share a couple of the stories that stick with you, that you want people to read more.
Right, yeah, so speaking of language, a lot of the challenge of writing about economics is trying to make it not quite so boring. And so what we do here is we tell stories of places that we've worked and that we admire around the country. And one of my favorites is where I open the book, is with the story of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and this is in South Dakota. And I had the good fortune, it was actually the very first project of mine at the Democracy Collaborative. We worked with a half dozen Native American groups around the country, trying to get some kind of economic activity going in Indian country, as they call it, that didn't involve tribal government. There's nothing wrong with tribal government, but that's about the only thing happening on most reservations. And so our program officer said, let's get something else going, and brought us in. Well, I worked with this young fellow, Nick Tilson. He's a 30-something young man. He's Native American. And he was part of some youth who were reviving spiritual practices on Pine Ridge. Some spiritual practices among natives had been outlawed until the 70s, and so they were reviving these. And he told us that in ceremony they got a message from the elders. And it was, how long will you allow your children to have their fate determined by someone else? Are you not warriors? And out of this, Nick said that they realized they wanted to form a community development corporation. They wanted to get something going. And they spent hundreds of hours in listening to the community. Now, I have to tell you, I've been to Pine Ridge and have studied it as part of this project. And unemployment on Pine Ridge has been estimated as high as 80%. And you go there and there is just nothing happening. People don't work. It's hard to spend money. When a dollar comes on to Pine Ridge, it exits within 48 hours. You simply can't spend money. People told me that if you wanted to buy chicken that was not breaded and frozen, and in the frozen section of the grocery, you had to drive 70 miles. So one of the things that they did, so they spent hours listening to people, and they decided they're going to build a regenerative community. there was not a single home for sale anywhere on Pine Ridge. You had families living, 3 families in a broken down trailer. So they said, we're going to build a whole regenerative community. It's going to have homes for rent, it's going to have homes for sale, it's going to have spiritual places and youth places and business, place for business. It's going to produce all its own energy, it's going to recycle all its own water, and they're going to train youth in construction skills as they build houses. And also, they created an employee-owned construction company, and that's something that we were helping them with. And last I heard, there were 13 houses that had been built. It's 34 acres. It's a $65 million project. The drawings were done by a leading green architect, and they hung for a while in the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum in Manhattan. Nick has inspired people all over the country. Dozens and dozens of tribal groups are now coming to him. So it's a wonderful story. And I want to just say, okay, so what's the lesson there? And that is, Nick probably could have said, I'm going to leave this reservation and I'm going to be a millionaire. He had the smarts to do that, but he didn't. He wanted to work for his community. So the value of community is just natural to indigenous people. And it's not the value that we have at the core of our economy, which is all about self. The rational economic man, the self-made man. And so you have in Silicon Valley, you have young entrepreneurs who say, I'm going to be a billionaire, and they do. And meanwhile, 1 out of 3 children in Silicon Valley are going hungry. So so we want to emphasize, it's a different way to organize an economy. Economies are organized around values. This is what systems science tells us. It says humans, we self-organize around what we care about, what we value. It's not laws that organize us. It's not regulations. It's values. And so what we look at in the book is what are the values that people are just organically taking up and caring about, and community is core of one.
Maybe say, because the book is built around some of these kind of pillars or value points, maybe give us sort of the architecture of the democratic economy.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to get it down to 6 values, and I ended up with 7. And just the other night, when I was in New York, actually somebody said, well, 7 is a sacred number. So I thought, oh, no, maybe that's the reason I ended up with 7. But we call them a new common sense. They're not rocket science. I mean, community, sustainability, those are the alpha and omega, right? We're in this together. We have to have a sustainable planet. You got to start there. Ethical finance. You still need money and lending and investing, but it needs to be ethical. Democratic ownership. We're still going to have ownership. It's not all going to be owned by the state, but it needs to be broad-based. It needs to be values-led. Inclusion. It was very important. I mean, more than half of the examples in the book are about people of color, because our nation will very soon be a majority people of color. And you don't want this work to be just a bunch of white people with their big ideas. And so we deliberately talk about inclusion and forefront that. And I personally went on a long journey of learning about this and reading quite a few books. And I came to see, not only to see, but to integrate it into my own theory and work, is that you have to start, I think, by recognizing that our economy was built on the backs of people of color. It was built on extraction. And it's not incidental, right? We can't just pick up from here and go off. We have to begin reckoning with that. So we're starting to do some work around that at the Democracy Collaborative. How can we integrate community wealth building, which is our approach of economic development, with racial equity, and be much more deliberate about that. So we're starting some projects around the country.
I'm curious, as someone who knows this area, are there things happening in the Boston area that you would sort of point to as, what does Boston, what is the democratic economy, what are the features of that?
Sure. Yeah. Boston is really a hub of this activity, and here we are at Impact Hub. There are a number of impact hubs around the country which came out of people who started Social Capital Markets, which is a big social investing conference. So the Impact Hub is itself one. We have Paul Bradley here tonight from Rock USA. Where's Paul? There's Paul, great. ROC USA is a fabulous organization. ROC means resident-owned communities. This is a model that was built in New Hampshire and is now going nationwide, thanks to Paul. This is helping people who live in resident-owned, I'm sorry, I always get my language wrong, it's manufactured housing communities. Manufactured housing communities, people are able to come together and buy the land that their manufactured homes sit on, and then they manage it collectively and cooperatively. And this is a model proven in New Hampshire and spreading around the country. It's a tremendous model. New England, so we have the New Economy Coalition here tonight. We had one of the co-sponsors, and let's see, Cooperative Fund of New England, I know is here. It's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Really been around at least 30 years. It's CDFI, which is a community development financial institution. It's doing real lending to real people in real places, and you can invest in it. We have a lot of impact investing and social responsible investing in Boston. It's a real hub of that. We're very lucky to have Harpoon Beer here tonight. That's a big employee-owned beer company in the Boston area. And recently, I would add that the state recently refunded the Massachusetts Center for Employee Ownership that happened in April. It had been defunct for several years, and now we have that back again. So we have a lot. There's a lot going on here.
In thinking about worker ownership, and you wrote a book, Owning the Future, which one thing I appreciated about it was it sort of gave people an overview of this. There's sort of like pure worker ownership, entire 100% employee ownership, but there's other hybrids or other kinds of broader ownership, community and worker ownership models. And now you're involved with this effort, 50 by 50. I think people would be, what's your perspective on the state of that work, and is there, a role for cities and states to sort of help accelerate that in some ways? How do you see that happening?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying just a little bit about the Democracy Collaborative. It's where I'm working now, and we have a staff of 40. Talia is here from Democracy Collaborative, came in from DC to help out tonight. And we have offices in DC and Cleveland, and I'm inexplicably here in Boston. We have offices, we have a few people in Europe. We do work all over the country. And what we call ourselves an R&D lab for the democratic economy. And it's like how, our co-founder was Gar Alkovitz, and Gar has been talking for many years about, the problem is in the system. We have to get serious about talking about a different kind of economic system, which is different than just wrapping regulations around the system that we have, which is what we've been trying to do for basically since the 30s. So what does that mean? And so we work in both theory and practice to help build a democratic economy. We did the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland. We helped design and launch 3 worker-owned companies there. They're helped by anchor institutions. We work a lot with anchor institutions, and these are nonprofit hospitals and universities and colleges. We call them anchors because they're anchored in place. They're not going to get up and leave. Cleveland is a place that lost more than half its population. Businesses fled, white people fled, and those who were left, in the very heart of Cleveland, there are a lot of these anchor institutions. Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University. And they said, how can we use our resources to benefit our own community? And they helped start the 3 Evergreen co-ops. So we're using anchor power to launch the worker co-op. So those are some of the kinds of things we do. But okay, so employee ownership. So why employee ownership? I in particular have been involved, and Karen Kahn is here tonight, who's been working with me on employee ownership. There's Karen. And of all the different models for employee ownership, we talked about public banking and resident-owned communities. I think employee ownership is a model that is really ready for scale. It's been around since the 70s. There are tax breaks in place. There are lots of technical assistance providers, and yet it has been stagnant for about 30 years. We have roughly the same number of employee owners that we've had for 30 years. But why is that? how could you jumpstart this to get going and go to scale? So we've been working on that. A lot of it is communication. There are cities that are involved in this. New York has put millions of dollars into growing worker co-ops. So there are different cities. Madison, Wisconsin is in this. Berkeley, San Francisco, a lot of cities are looking at this. And one of the things that we talk about is that, we've lost a lot of our Main Street businesses, right? They all went to the mall. We've lost a whole generation of organic food companies. You may know that consumer-owned co-ops started the organic food business, but then the big multinationals ran off with it, and there were a lot of companies that began that were very socially responsible, and they were all bought up by multinationals. Odwalla was sold to Coke, I guess. Yeah, Coca-Cola. I mean, all the little cool brands that you can think of, most of those are owned by multinationals. It's happening to craft beer also. But there's another way that founders can exit. I mean, right now in the next 10 years, 2.3 million businesses will be on the market. Baby boom entrepreneurs are aging. Nobody lives forever. What do you do with your business? Only 1 in 7 will pass it to their children. So they will either sell to a competitor, which means you lose the jobs, you move out, take the company out of the city. Most of them will close. A few will sell to big multinationals or to venture capital. But there's another way. You can sell to employees. There are huge tax incentives for doing so. It's a prime moment. We could actually bend the curve of history. We could have the same kind of commitment to employee ownership that we once had to broad-based home ownership. And so we're working on to try to get that going. And the idea is, could you prove in one sector that an alternative, democratic economy model can really go to scale? We think that could have an impact on the public consciousness.
And so what does 50 by 50 mean?
Right, thank you. So we gathered people together and began to talk about what would an audacious goal be. And the goal that we came up with was 50 million worker owners by 2050. And that would be, it would be larger as a proportion of the economy than manufacturing was in its heyday. It would be a big part of the economy.
Changing gears just a little bit, in one part of the book, I think we are sort of living in a period both of extreme income and wealth inequality and the sort of ecological crisis. When you said 2050, I always think of like mission goals or something, so I was like, oh, great, expanded work ownership. You have an interesting chapter in the book that is about sort of a new approach to approaching the climate crisis that I think would just be fun to put out there on the table and hear you talk about, since we don't hear about it.
We have a project at Democracy Collaborative called the Next System Project. And their job is basically to sit down and dream up big ideas. And one of the big ideas that they have dreamed up is called quantitative easing for the planet. And so the idea is, we want worker ownership, we want publicly owned banks, but we don't have time, right, for all of that little stuff to grow and scale. We've got to do something fast, right? And so what if we just bought out the 25 largest fossil fuel companies and wound them down? You'd have to buy 51%, and we calculated mid-year 2018 it would cost $700 billion. Well, that's not a small sum. But spread it over 7 years, that's $100 billion a year. It starts to seem a little more reasonable. Also, it's just a fraction of the 1.5 trillion that Trump gave away in tax breaks. It's also a small fraction of what we're spending on the Iraq War, which is probably going to be multiple trillions. And then how would you finance that? Well, the idea, and this was Gar's conception, is you use quantitative easing. And this is the same way that we bailed out the big banks in 2008 and 2009. And some of you might remember, it's indelibly etched in my brain, the image of Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, on his knees in front of Nancy Pelosi, saying, I need $700 billion to bail out the big banks, right? And he got it like that, and far more. When you add up all the quantitative easing the US government did, it went into the trillions, and Europe did very, very much the same. Trillions and trillions of dollars in bailing out the guys who caused the crisis in the first place. And so then the question becomes, what counts as a crisis, right? Is, banks failing, that's a crisis. You're going to get trillions of dollars in the blink of an eye. No one's going to quibble about that. The planet at risk of a catastrophe that could go on forever, that doesn't count as a crisis. So that's an example of capital bias. What happens to capital, well, now that really matters, that's really important. What happens to everybody else and all life on Earth? It's just off the radar screen. It's just off the radar screen. That's, so one of the things I like about the quantitative easing for the planet is just even as a thought experiment. It tells you what would it mean to have an economy that put life first. Well, it would mean that we would bail out the planet just as fast as we would bail out the big banks. That's what it would mean. And I will say, it's a pretty crazy idea, QE for the planet. We did submit this. Carla Scandier, one of my colleagues, has been leading this project, and she submitted this to a climate, I think it was called the Climate Accelerator Project. That sounds counterintuitive. But anyway, it's like, what? Maybe that's not the right name. But anyway, it was a bunch of foundations that got together and said, we need to end the age of oil. Send us your ideas. They got 600 ideas. There were 3 that were selected for funding, and this was one of the 3. So at least a few people think it's, it has this kind of, wow, that's kind of crazy, but what if? It has that kind of what if quality. So we're working on it. We've got a couple $100,000 to work on it.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask one more question and invite Lucas to come chat with us. And that's just, I know that Ted has been spending a lot of time across the pond in the UK.
Yeah.
There's kind of a receptiveness. Some of the ideas, the democratic economy, are part of the sort of Labour Party manifesto. We have Boris Johnson now, kind of there's like a Reagan, Thatcher, Trump, Boris Johnson thing going on here, but you could, I'm curious, just what are you seeing in the UK, and is there anything that we could learn from that, both from a social movement point of view as well as sort of a politics?
Well, this is the final story that I tell in the book, and it's really amazing what's going on in the UK. There's a fellow, Matthew Brown, who is a city councillor in the town of Preston. It's 140,000 people. Preston, at one time, is in England, and it was at one time the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. I think the spinning wheel was invented there. And this city was really hit hard after the 2008 downturn. They were gonna use their money and attract a big corporation, right? Well, that fell apart, and they were down and out. It's a Rust Belt city. They were a lot like Cleveland, very beat up. It had been dubbed the suicide capital of England. That's how bad things were in Preston. And so there was this half-time city council person, right? That's all the city council job was half-time. And Matthew Brown started looking on his computer, and he stumbled on the Democracy Collaborative, and he came upon the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland, and he said, well, that's kind of a funny thing to see in the U.S. That seems kind of socialist. What if we could do something like that in his city, in Preston? So they called Ted up, and Ted's like, I never heard of Preston. And he goes over there and he starts advising them. They used a big anchor strategy. They put together a whole bunch of strategies, and I'll just mention a few of them. But one of them is they said, okay, what are the assets that we have that we can work with in our city? Well, one of the things they had is they had a big housing authority, and they had some pension funds, and they have the police department and city government. And they said, what if we used our pension funds and we reinvested money locally? And they put a couple £100 million investing locally in Preston, things that they could do legally as a pension fund. And they said, what if we used all the purchasing power of like the police station and the schools and the city and all these things, and they declared themselves a living wage city, They made that the standard. They started buying locally instead of buying, you know, whatever, food and so forth. They tried to buy more locally, so they relocated another couple hundred million pounds into the local economy, and they started supporting worker co-ops. They're working at starting a community-owned bank. They're starting a non-predatory payday lender, right? So if you're desperate for money and you need that little bit of money to get you to payday, if you're late by a week, they're not going to hit you with a big fine. They're not going to raise your interest rates. So it's a non-extractive payday lender. So they're doing these kinds of things. Well, lo and behold, it seems to be working. It's catching on. Preston was recently named by the Radical Association, PricewaterhouseCoopers, named them the most improved city in the UK. Unemployment has gone down, poverty has gone down, this Preston was named by PricewaterhouseCoopers a better place to live than London. So it's an example, and you know, we were just thrilled by this, and we have been doing some advising to the Corbyn government. The form of economic development that they're doing, and we call it community wealth building. And community wealth building is a term that's really catching on in the UK. Corbyn has started a whole unit, community wealth building unit, and we're helping to advise them. We decided, well, we're going to pay you your other half of your salary, which you're not getting. And we found some money, we made him a fellow of the Democracy Collaborative. So now, it was interesting, Matthew said, he used to work as a clerk in government, that was his other half. And he said, well, now I'm free. And for Matthew, free means he's working 60 hours a week. He's traveling nonstop. But he's had 60 cities come to him and say, we want to do what Preston is doing. We got a call from Tanzania. Tanzania wants to do what Preston is doing. We have a little contract with Tanzania now. Sarah McKinley's working on that. So it's remarkable. And so this is informing what Jeremy Corbyn is doing and what Labour is doing. It's written about in The Economist all the time. Preston has become a phenomenon in the UK. And I think what I would say is inspiring about Preston in particular and about the UK is it shows how you can begin to build a politics around this stuff, which we don't do, we haven't done as much in this country, but you can. People will get behind this if they begin to see, oh, you can actually organize an economy a different way, and look, it actually works. People will get behind it.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite Lucas Turner Owens to join us. For those of you who don't know Boston Ujima, this is one of our sort of local guiding lights, and we thought it would be fun to bring Lucas into the conversation, talk a little bit about Boston Ujima as an example of sort of our local democratic economy at work, and then open up to questions and your questions for all of us.
So one way that I like to describe the work that we're doing is by sort of explaining a chronology of how we got to where we are now. So we started out as a group of folks who were studying the question, what could be a catalyst for economic development in Boston, specifically in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, where a lot of economic activity that's been seen in other parts of Boston hasn't really been seen. So a few different folks came together. Boston Impact Initiative, which is a racial justice, place-based fund. City Life Vida Urbana, which is a housing justice nonprofit. Groups of activists, business owners, and investors all came together to say, what's the right solution for this community that we're working in? Folks were looking at public banking. Folks were looking at community loan funds. There's one in Western Mass in particular we looked at called the Pioneer Valley Grows Fund. And also venture capital models, all different types of strategies. And what we landed on was a sort of basically a community loan fund, mimicking in some ways Boston Impact Initiative, which is a partner of ours and a separate nonprofit loan fund. But just deciding we wanted to do that wasn't where we stopped. We then said, how can we sort of apply the theory of participatory budgeting to the model of an impact investment fund? So we spent 2016 both building as a membership organization and building a staff. So Nia Evans, who's our director, came over from the NAACP. We built out as a membership organization to 400 members, many of whom identify as working class people of color in those three neighborhoods. And the theory was, if we could build a membership that was big enough, we could have events where we would ask the question, what are the businesses that you love that are here? What are the businesses that you need that aren't here? And what are the ones you'd like to see replaced? The businesses that folks love, that could become our candidate list, to sort of speak in private equity or VC terms. Then we could look at those companies and see if they meet the community's social and environmental impact metrics. And I can speak a little more about that. And then finally, we'd have the community vote on which businesses to actually fund. So the process was trying to bridge participatory budgeting, as has been seen in New York and now in Boston, with the theory of how loan funds typically work. So then in the following year, I came on board as the second hire as our fund manager. We continued to grow the membership organization. We grew to about 500 members. And we started to figure out the mechanics of the fund. How could we actually do this? In 2018, we launched the fund. It was late in the year. We spent most of that year with our lawyers just figuring out how we could make a unique subordination agreement, an offering memo, the note structure. The one thing I'll stop and say about that I think is pretty cool is that we designed the notes to both be accessible to anyone. So it only takes $50 to purchase a 3-year note in our fund for an investor. But we also designed the capital stacks so that the smallest dollar investors have the most security. So in the event of a default, we use our grant reserves, but then we use the capital from foundations who buy a different type of note. Then we use the capital from accredited investors who buy a different kind of note, and finally, non-accredited working class investors. So we launched the fund in 2018. 2019, we have now since raised about $900,000. We hope to make our first investment this fall. And we are looking at a company that was named in that process of those assemblies where we asked those questions. One of those businesses is a worker-owned composting business. So bringing it back to how, not only is this wealth building hopefully for our investors who are getting, 3% is pretty modest, but if we are investing in companies that are worker-owned, hopefully we're doing something different than you'd see in VC or other types of lending. So that's how we got here, but we also got here with a lot of partners who were leaders in the space and part of the new economy. We borrow from some of the community wealth building strategies from Democracy Collaborative, so we work with Children's Hospital right now, where we act as advocates for the businesses that we might invest in, so that if we can get them new contracts, and actually there's a member here who's helped us with some of that thinking, we can then sort of lend into that new contract. So if we can say, hey, Children's work with this caterer, we then can lend to that caterer because we know that their business has increased in a certain way. But we've got a lot of thought partners, so I just want to acknowledge that this wasn't just sort of a series of realizations. This was us borrowing from the best ideas from both activism and the solidarity economy and other nonprofits.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you so much.
Let's open up, and I'll walk around a little bit with my microphone, if that's okay, and maybe introduce yourself.
My name is Ivy Jack. I work at North Star Asset Management. My question to Marjorie, and we have invested in Ujima, but my question to Marjorie, since I have kind of been in this impact, socially responsible space, I will say one of the things that I've been disappointed about is that I don't feel like there is a justice angle to a lot of this work. And so I know you had started to talk about some things related to race and race equality, but if you could just really expand on kind of what your thinking is and how that would work, it'd be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I do think it's missing from a lot of this work. I think that you're right about that. I will say with the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland, that was they were built in a neighborhood that's 95% African American, and so it was very deliberate to benefit those communities. So that's one example. So how is this being built out? There are some people who are working in the worker co-op space, particularly with a racial angle. And is that what you mean when you say justice? Mm-hmm. For example, there's a group in the Bay Area that is helping women of color start cleaning cooperatives. And so they go out and clean in houses, and they actually own the company and can get higher wages. Also, one of the companies I write about in the book is called Cooperative Home Care Associates. Karen, who's here, used to work at their sister organization, Paraprofessional Health Institute. It's a 33-year-old company. It has 1,200 about 1,200 workers, mostly Latina and African American women. doing home care. So home care is an area where these are good jobs for entry-level people, low-income people, and there's a movement now to spread this model. There's 15 of these worker-owned home health care companies, either in existence or in formation right now. So that's one example of a movement. I think part of this might be sector-driven. This is one of the things that we're always thinking about. How do you scale this stuff? So some of this work, right now we're exploring possibly some sector work with commercial laundries attached to anchor institutions. And can they do hiring? I mean, they're sort of natural entry-level jobs. So what I would say is, it's interesting. We're doing some work with finance, trying to get more capital into employee ownership, and I'm working with a very large family office that is interested in this space and in investing in employee ownership, and they are a little reluctant to do it with a racial lens, I'll say. So I find that it's an issue that not everybody gets it. I think we're not quite there yet. And this is one of the reasons why we're trying to take this up at the Democracy Collaborative, where we have a new vice president, Ronnie Galvin, who is, he's a man of color and very accomplished, and he's building out some of our racial justice work. And so we want to find out what is the intersection between community wealth building and racial justice. And he's working with the faith community and with activist groups. And so our idea is, and it's kind of at the idea stage now, but our idea is, can you go into communities, particular cities, and we're sort of looking for those cities now, and say, let's start with acknowledging the depth of the problem. So how many children are going hungry in this city? And what color are those children? How much wealth? I mean, we know that African Americans have about 1/10 the wealth, the asset wealth, as white families. What are the wealth statistics in this community? Let's start by looking at the nature of the problem. Ronnie has the idea that maybe there need to be some kind of truth and reconciliation process. I don't know, we're sort of at the early stages. And then can you also bring in, well, let's do some economic development, which is about using our local assets. What are the assets that we have? What can we develop locally? And how can we be inclusive as we do that? So I think that, so we're in an exploratory phase on this. There are some places that are farther ahead than we are. There's a great group in the Bronx. Do you know what the name of that one is?
Is it the Bronx Exchange?
I know
Or
that one.
CBI, the broader umbrella?
Yeah, that MIT is doing?
Yeah.
What's it called?
So the Bronx Exchange came out of the MIT Media Lab, but I think CBI is the broader parent
And that,
nonprofit.
what's that stand for?
I think it's the Cooperative Development Institute.
Yes, Cooperative Development Institute.
Yeah, Cooperative Development
I'm
Institute.
fine with that.
Okay, that's great, that's great. So there's some very exciting work being done. I think some people are further than others in figuring it out. Yeah.
Lucas, did you add anything to that?
To that particular question, no, but I think I agree with you.
I'm Amy McMahon, and I'm a JP resident and also want to start a worker business in the future. But you started talking about exploitative capitalism and as being a white, race issue, and I just wondered, could you expound on that? Because I've traveled around the world and I've seen actually exploitative capitalism in a lot of other countries that are not white, so just wondered where that came out of.
Yeah. I think you're right. Capital will extract what it can from whoever it can. One of the things that, just tell this little side anecdote, and I'll come back to your question. One of the things that we say in the book is Martin Luther King, toward the end, he had broadened his focus from people of color to all poor people. He was preparing his Poor People's March. He was in the South to support garbage collectors, and that was when he was shot. But shortly before that, he shared with Harry Belafonte, he said, I think we're working for integration, and I think we're going to succeed. But he said, I have this troubling feeling that we're integrating into a burning house. that as long as the entire economy is not working for ordinary people, it's not enough to just integrate into the economy as it is. And that was one of his final insights, and I think he's right about that. That we have to recognize racial bias, but then we have to recognize that the economy it will extract basically from anyone. And that's why we've lost the whole middle class. But so how does it start racially? There's, I don't know if some of you know Boston Review, really wonderful kind of a journal of ideas and the arts here in Boston. They've had some really good issues about this. And one of the things, they had a whole bunch of black historians talking about capitalism. And you know, when you study business and economics, you start with Adam Smith, right? That's where that capitalism begins. Adam Smith and the wonders of the pin factory. Well, the pin factory employed apparently about a dozen people. And the real story of capitalism, according to these black historians, really goes back to slavery. And so you have the looms of Manchester, England. They're weaving the cloth. You have the slave plantations in the U.S. that are growing the cotton, and it's all financed by the financiers in New York, mostly Morgan and those so forth. And what these historians, the story they tell is that they said the slaves were literally the capital. That in order to grow cotton, you need money for seed and for planting and to keep you alive keep everything going until you can sell the cotton. And so you need these loans. Well, what's the collateral for those loans? It was the slaves. The slaves were literally the capital for that emerging system. And one historian said there was more. The wealth in slaves was more than all of the manufacturing in the country combined at that time. So the literal capital was slavery. Then you go and you look at colonialism. You know, nations of color were considered plantations. They were owned by the British Crown, and there were a lot. So racial extraction took many, many forms, and I think it was where a lot of wealth was created.
Can I just add one thing to that? I mean, it's not up for dispute that capitalism is practiced by all types of people of all different shades, sure. But I think about sort of like Olaudah Equiano was a former slave who then owned slaves, or in this country we sent African Americans to Liberia to enslave Liberians. And when I think about your question, I think about sort of what capitalism rewards, right? It rewards the holders of wealth. Many of those holders of wealth became wealthy through ill-gotten gains, through slavery is one example. So it perpetuates a certain type of racial extraction if you are starting certain people at step 10 and others at step negative 3,000. Right?
Because I'm just looking at a short period in history, because you could go back to slavery, going back to China and earlier in the Middle East.
there's a long
slavery
discussion,
is based
sure.
on that idea of exploiting people, but it's more than just American colonialism. That's
Chuck's the man with the microphone. Thank you, Chuck.
Hey, thanks for this. I'm Pat. I work at another SRI firm, Seven Asset Management. I'll stand up. It's really annoying when you write a book and then someone's like, why didn't you do that? But I will say, yeah. Oh, okay. So that's not what I'm doing right now. You have like a lot of principles and a lot of examples have to do with non-state or extra-state solutions.
Yeah.
How does the state have to grow specifically to meet those solutions? Because it does, right? Like government jobs have been very good for black and brown people over a century and a half, and we need a civilizational response to climate change.
Yeah.
So where specifically does the state grow out to meet the stuff that you're saying? And also, just another thing, in England, it's so cool, the organic pathway from these ideas into politics was just a guy ringing you up, and now you're talking to Corbyn. So what's the pathway into national politics here for these ideas? Is it Demos, the think tank? Is it Elizabeth Warren's campaign? What is it?
Yeah, I think that's starting to happen, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one of the things that we talk about is the notion of laboratories of democracy, and this was Justice Brandeis talked about this back in the Depression, and he said, you can basically have little experiments at the state level that are laboratories of ideas, and then they can scale up. This happened in the Depression. For example, Alaska began giving some money to old people the idea that you shouldn't starve or go homeless when you're old. Well, that became the idea for Social Security. So, and there were similar experiments that led to the Tennessee Valley Authority and to agricultural. We have a huge number of agricultural cooperatives in this country, which began in the Depression. Farmers would get together and help each other, and then the government would support the build out of agricultural cooperatives. So you're absolutely right. The government is essential. And so how does that begin to happen? And it can also be city and state government as well as federal. But we're starting to see some of that right now. Elizabeth, there was a story that moved today by the New York Times. Elizabeth Warren is talking about democratizing finance. Isn't that a lovely phrase? I thought,
Yeah, it's great.
and she hadn't even read my book, right? Democratizing finance, right? So kind of bringing finance back to earth to serve real people. So that's happening. She also, Warren talks about, she has put forth the Accountable Capitalism Act, and this is something that is far more radical than I think most people recognize. And the idea is that if you are a company with $1 billion in revenue or more, you must have a federal charter. Most corporations are today chartered at the state level. You would need a federal charter, and you would have new fiduciary duties. You would have a duty not only to shareholders, but to employees, the community, and the environment. And and I don't know the details of how it will be enforced and so forth, but I know there will be seats for workers on the board. But the idea is, I think what I like about this is it gets to the design of ownership of companies. I mean, antitrust is important, but that's about size. Purpose is also important. We need to move beyond the point where we think it's legitimate for companies to have a purpose of enriching shareholders only. So that's an example. Bernie Sanders has been talking about employee ownership. Corbyn put out a plan for employee ownership funds, and the idea would be every company, I think above a certain size, would need to give 1% of equity to employees every year, up to about 10%. And it would not be tradable. It would stay in trust, and employees would also have the voting power that would go along with it. And Bernie Sanders heard about this. We shared this idea with him, and he said, "Well, I like it. 10% is not enough. Let's go to 20%." So he's pushing that. Others, Kirsten Gillibrand, and I know her star is not rising right now, but she's been talking about employee ownership. In fact, she did succeed in getting some legislation passed, oddly enough, in August, that directed the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to add employee ownership to its toolkit. So, yes, I think these things are starting to find their way into politics, and I hope we see a lot more of it.
Thanks, Pat, for that question.
Chuck's coming
Bounce
around
around.
here with the mic.
Hi, this might be off point, but I'm wondering if there's a way to infiltrate colleges and universities. I'm retired from college for 35 years of professional practice courses where students are really craving new business models for what to do when they graduate. And also to go back to your first point about language, it seems like that's a great place to start to, introduce the language, a different language.
Yeah, it's curious about how do you get these ideas into the academy? There's a lot of brilliant work being done by progressive economists, all kinds of ecological science, ecological economics, and feminist economics, and it's called heterodox economics. Is contrasted with orthodox economics. But it's very hard to get it into the mainstream, what do you call it? The curriculum that you have to take.
Curriculum.
Yeah, the main curriculum. I've been told, I was told by one economics professor at Harvard, he was trying to get a course in alternative economics into the economics curriculum. And he finally got it done after many years of pressing, and they told him, well, you can teach this, but economics majors can't take it. Isn't that amazing? It's very similar about business schools. I'm part of there's a community of scholars who are studying employee ownership and have done lots of research on it. There's Rutgers University runs a whole institute, and there's probably 150 scholars studying employee ownership. And I asked Joseph Blasi there at Rutgers, well, how many of them are in business schools? And he said very few, maybe 10 out of 150. They're in sociology, they're in political science, but they're not in the business schools. I only know of one course in employee ownership that's taught in a business school. And my theory of it is that, I used to see this back in the days when I was running Business Ethics Magazine. The same thing happened with business ethics. You couldn't get that into the curriculum. When it got into the curriculum, usually it was like a quarter of a credit in a business ethics course. My sense of it is that the schools, particularly the business and economic schools, are the keepers of the ideology. They're going to be almost the last place to let go. Business people know the world is changing, but inside the academy, they're holding tight. There has been a movement of PhD students in economics to revolt and challenge their professors. I haven't heard how it's doing lately, but people are working on it.
Could I just add one comment to that?
Sure.
At UMass Amherst, they do teach heterodox economics. It's one of the few universities that does teach that. But I agree with your broader point that business schools are kind of the keepers of the old way. We've presented at Yale School of Management, and actually Wharton, the #1 business school in the country, just reached out to write a case study on Ujima. So hopefully we're going to see the idea in a lot of different folks and get them to think different.
That's good.
This connects exactly that point. I'm an academic economist at Boston University in the School of Management, in the business school. And everything that you said is actually happening. The student interest is really pulling formal courses and curricula in that area.
Good.
Encouragingly, we've got an endowment for an institute that is coming online to look at business ethics and impact investment. And there are some research projects as well as some curricular initiatives that we're working on. The struggle we have is actually we're looking to connect with the practice to do that. And sort of the usual connections that the business schools have tend to be with corporate America and with financial institutions, and rarely with this crowd. And so I find it's very encouraging and refreshing to see that.
That's great. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Another route into universities and colleges is through pension funds. There is a movement to encourage pension funds, not just pension, but their endowments, to do impact investing and socially responsible investing. There are some people here who know about that if anyone wants to comment. But
Just on that point, so I work with the Intentional Endowments Network.
There you go.
Based here in Boston, and we do some work with the Democracy Collaborative, but it really is about, how do you put opportunities in front of endowment decision makers in a way that they recognize.
Right.
And we're seeing that movement start to happen, and a lot of it is student-led, but a lot of it is also just this return to redefining what long-term thinking is. And so I think being able to connect all of these tools together is really important. But
thank you for that.
I'd be happy to talk to folks about.
Yeah, that's exactly the movement that I was referencing. Thanks for that.
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating. I actually have two totally separate questions. The first on this point is, it baffles my mind that the movement to end apartheid was motivated by student activism to get endowments out of South Africa. And yet somehow, for all other kinds of economic transformation, that hasn't taken off. And it seems like there's so much opportunity there. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then totally separately, I'm also curious to hear about the food sector specifically, because a lot of the examples of cooperatives and employee-owned businesses come out of the food sector. And the food sector is a particular place where I think consumers could vote with our dollars. So I want to hear from you, what are some of the ways that we, just as regular average consumers, can also participate in rebuilding the economy with our food dollars?
Yeah, South African divestment was one of the huge triumphs of socially responsible investing. Shirley, do you want to talk about this at all? I'm putting her on the spot. This is my wife, Shelley Alpern, who works in socially responsible investing.
Well, I think the sort of the modern day equivalent of the South African divestment movement, one of the equivalents or something that's taking inspiration from it is the movement to divest from private prisons and the whole supply chain of businesses that are engaged with the private prisons and serve that. So I think it would get us too off topic if I went on and on about divestment, so I'll talk to you about it afterwards. But that's my, I don't think that divestment is a dead tactic, but I think it has to be used in a very sort of careful way. It's sort of like a tool that doesn't work for everything you're trying to accomplish, but when it is appropriate, it's a brilliant thing to employ.
Thanks for that.
Hi, I'm David Hyman from Jamaica Plain. And I'd like to ask something specific. Maybe you can broaden it. Maybe there's something about the problems of the common in what I'm asking. I talk about it specifically because my area of activism, it gets to be a problem. If somebody owns their own home or owns an apartment building or owns their own home, and they make an improvement like solar panels or more efficient heating, they get the benefit immediately. It may increase their property values and there's a payback period. All kinds of works very well. But rental housing is a little more difficult. To talk about somebody owns a 3-decker or an apartment building and rents it out to tenants, and normally the tenants pay the utility bills. So the landlord has a little problem if they want to improve by putting solar or more efficient heating or insulation in, because the savings in the utility bills they don't realize. It's the tenants who do. But the tenants don't have access to capital, they don't own the building, so they're not in a position to make the improvement. So it kind of gets stuck in trying to get things improved. And that's quite a bit for low income or middle income where there's a lot of rental going on. So it's a kind of thing where the ownership and the benefit are different, particularly where there's low and middle income aspects. So how would do you know of ways where the landlords and tenants can get together, where the landlord owns the building and the tenants are paying for the utilities, and how do you work that? Especially multiply it by 1 million. Right?
Yeah, so you're raising some broad issues of ownership and government incentives, and I think what you're asking is probably beyond my area of expertise. But it does point to the fact that these incentives have to be constructed very, very carefully. I know that government put in incentives to install solar and gave an incentive of thousands of dollars if you put solar on your roof. Well, then companies sprang up and said, we'll put it on your roof and we'll lease it to you. And so then they got the thousands of dollars of incentives rather than the homeowners. So it is quite possible to craft incentives that you think are doing the right thing and they actually did get turned around.
Just Lucas, quick point on that. Are you familiar with the concept of net metering?
Oh yeah.
So there's a concept called virtual net metering where folks can aggregate dollars that they would then invest in a set of solar panels that wouldn't be on their physical property, but then that group that funded it would receive some discount on their utility. So Resident Energy, based in Dorchester, is experimenting with how to do that for renters, specifically low-income renters.
There's also a concept called property assessed clean energy. Okay, yes, which is meant to address specifically that problem.
But what group did you mention?
Resident Energy.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Margaret Miley with the Cooperative Development Institute. Just a comment and then a follow-up question. We're working, and I saw Paul Bradley is here as well, and we're both part of a network. Both of our organizations are part of a network in New Hampshire that's doing something very interesting, where we're doing sort of a maybe possibly accidental cross-generational connection between co-op members. I think a lot of folks don't understand, younger folks, and even people my age who are semi-old, don't understand that in the 30s and 40s there were a boatload of cooperatives being built, particularly in the food sector, utilities, finance. A lot of folks don't understand a credit union as a co-op, etc. And so these groups have gotten together and are starting to collectively market the power of cooperatives. And they recently did a count of the number of cooperative members in New Hampshire, and it's 700,000. And so they're starting we're starting a combined media campaign to raise the visibility of cooperatives, because I think a lot of folks don't understand. For example, a third of the lobsters that come through Maine, that you get through Maine, come through a cooperative. So I'm wondering if you're seeing examples of that cross-generational connection in other settings.
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing it right here tonight. You know, so when I have seen this, track this work as a journalist over several decades, so much of the work is very granular, it's very technical. You know, we just talked about how do you do net metering, how do you do impact investing. But what I think we are at a moment where we need to see ourselves as a single movement. And we need to be serious about having real ambition. Not just figuring out the little things, but recognizing the economy that we have is in trouble. I mean, in serious trouble. And what is the next economy that's going to be there? We're trying to name it the democratic economy. I don't know if that's right. I hope that it is. I mean, I think back to feminism, say in the 70s and 80s, and you could have people working on violence against women, or you could have equal funding for girls' athletics, or you could have equal pay for women. And imagine if we thought of those each as separate battles that were not connected to each other. But we don't. We see them all connected by the issues of sexism and feminism. And so I think that the issue of capital bias and recognizing that our economy really is designed for capital. That's why it's called capitalism. And we can have an economy designed for all of us. I think if we can see ourselves as a single movement, I think that could be a huge step toward change. That's our hope.
I want to make sure we have some time just to talk to each other and buy some books. So there are 3 people who have had their hands up. I'm going to just ask them each to make a brief question.
Great.
Lightning round. We'll hear all 3 of them, and then you can wrap it anyway. So you're here and then.
I'm Colin. I'm a PhD student in Sweden. I had a slight question going back to the socialism point on the notion of public versus employee ownership. Because you mentioned, for example, in the quantitative easing for the ecological crisis, it seems to be advocating for public ownership there, if I understood it correctly. I'm not sure I did. But you seem to be advocating for worker ownership in almost every other sphere. And I'm wondering, in terms of who the returns come back to, why not public ownership in terms of everyone instead of just worker ownership?
Great. There's one.
Yes, my name is Jim Havel. I'm with the Massachusetts chapter of the Public Banking Institute. The question is related to that. One thing that hasn't been brought up here, which cooperative ownership and democratizing finance does not really address, is the fact that as long as there is a finite or positive cost of capital, economic decisions will be based on economic discounting, which means that you disregard the future, as Keynes put it so adroitly. The long run doesn't matter because on the long run we're all dead. If you don't agree or you regard that point of view as immoral, then you must come up with an economic system that drives the cost of capital to 0, which essentially means the end of capitalism as we know it. Just to give one example of various ways in which that can be done. Really quick. The city of Philadelphia during colonial times was the bank. You wanted to get a loan, you went to the city, they gave you a loan, you paid it back with interest. The interest was collected publicly, therefore it did not cause a cost of capital or a time value of money to occur because it was only the city that got it. The city didn't need to levy taxes because it was the bank. It collected the interest instead. It worked very well for quite a long time. That's just one example, it's not the only one. But it's an issue that I think needs to be addressed by somebody like the Democracy Collaborative at some point.
Get cracking on that. Final question here.
I'm afraid I don't have a question. I mean, I have a lot of questions. I'm Marjorie. I have an answer to your question about South Africa and what happened there. 40 years ago, I was working on a desegregation of the Boston Public Schools and moved from race and schooling to race in South Africa in 1983. I think the quick answer is that people fell victim to elevating tactics to the level of purpose. In other words, to divest or not to divest was always the issue rather than now what. And fortunately, there are people like Pat Tamano and others who are looking at beyond divestment, now what? So I guess there is a question, and I think the answer is something we all can work on. It's been certainly the focus of my life for the last 37 years. And that is, how can we reconnect economic activity to civic virtue? And I think it's possible. There are many entry points. There are many ways of doing that from the ground level that feed directly, as Dana Meadows talks about, into leverage points that can move this along. Because if not now, then when is really the question.
Well, these are all great questions. So the question of public ownership versus worker ownership, I would take out the versus. And what I would say is right now we have basically a monoculture of ownership. We have this idea that capital is going to own everything and that that's legitimate. And we need a diversity of kinds of ownership. Commons, worker, community, government. And I think the question is to say, okay, what is appropriate where? For example, like right now, should we have, I mean, is the healthcare sector so important that it shouldn't be left to profit maximizing companies, that it should be owned by all of us, it should be there to serve the people? I think we're heading in that direction. I think, you know, we have an idea, we're exploring a publicly owned pharmaceutical. I mean, do we want medicines owned by profit maximizing companies that are going to jack up the price 1,000 times? And that's ludicrous. And so yes. And then other times, I mean, I don't think all companies ought to be owned by the government, and I think that probably most people would support that. So what works where? I think that's the question that we are, where we are. You raise a very technical question, which I don't think I can really address here, but you're right. I mean, capital is accustomed to having very high rates of return, and are those going to be possible if we're going into a slow growth or low growth economy? What's happening now is that they're extracting more from labor. So more and more is going to capital and less is going to labor. And you know, that can't go on forever. And so there's going to be, who knows what kind of reckoning is going to come there. But you know, Thomas Piketty did talk about how, he said if the growth of the rate of capital exceeds the growth of GDP, right? If GDP is growing 2 or 3% and capital is growing at 6 or 7%, where does that money come from? Where does the rest of it come from? Well, it basically comes from extracting from somebody else or creating some kind of crazy derivatives. So yes, there are some hard questions and some hard choices that we're gonna face ahead, and we don't have all the answers here today, but I'm confident that we can find them. So thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Let's give it up for Marjorie and Lucas. Thank you so much.